Awesome. Thanks, everyone, and for your interest in Minnesota DNR's recent work on trade pathways for invasive species. And thanks to the Canadian Council on Invasive Species for having us here to share. We know that global trade drives invasive species introductions. So we're really excited to talk with you about some of our efforts aimed at preventing introductions and learning more about these pathways. So our goal for the time here is really to try to represent a bit about what we know about the risks associated with trade pathways for invasive species, provide kind of an overview of key results from the DNR's recent trade pathways projects, including surveys of consumers and businesses and an in-store assessment. So I'll start with just some brief background. I'm going to talk about projects related to working with businesses, and then Tina will talk about a project that we worked on related more to working with hobbyists. Then we'll talk just a little bit about some kind of beyond Minnesota issues and have some time for discussion. So just to start with some brief background on the issue of invasive species in trade, I'll clarify that the trades that we've been focusing on are those that rely on the movement and possession of live organisms. So these include the horticulture, pet, food, bait, and biological supply trades. Based on the agency and scientific literature that's out there, conversations with experts around the country working in this area, and some searching for invasive species online, we know that about 42 or 2/3 of Minnesota prohibited invasive species, those that are illegal to possess, have been documented in these trades. Just a few of these species for your information include red swamp crayfish, hydrilla, snakehead fishes. Additionally, around 15 or 3/4 of Minnesota regulated invasive species have been documented in these trades. Regulated species can be thought of as somewhat akin to a watch list, but they are legal to sell in Minnesota. And around 15 additional risky species, unlisted species for which risk assessments have suggested likely harmful impacts to the Great Lakes region were also documented in these trades. Some additional issues are that release of species from these trades is not uncommon. There are some great outreach programs out there, but they're not always recognized by individuals in the industries or their customers. Species are often mislabeled or unlabeled. We don't know what the supply chains look like. A better understanding of this would help us to address risky practices and points in the process of moving organisms from one entity to another. You can buy a lot of invasive species online, and authorities for inspections and enforcement are somewhat limited. In the past 2.5 years or so, the Minnesota DNR has ramped up its efforts on trade pathway invasive species prevention. Just to name a few projects, here you can see we developed online and print resources for live organism sellers and hobbyists. If you haven't seen these and you're interested, you can find them by searching for Trade Pathways Minnesota DNR. We also hosted a workshop with representatives of the aquarium and water garden industries in Minnesota to start to understand their perspectives. We conducted surveys of Minnesota sellers across most of the trades, as well as aquarium and water garden hobbyists. Last year, we hired a contractor to visit pet stores and seafood markets to both examine their stocks for invasive species and provide education. And we also conducted a survey of aquarium and water garden hobbyists. So now I'm gonna jump into some of the projects we have been working on in more detail. I'm gonna try to keep this pretty high level and share findings from multiple projects. So first, I'll give an overview of these projects that relate more to working with businesses. So the photo on this slide is from a workshop we held back in 2019. We worked with our community-based social marketing contract partners, Ken Donnelly and Kat. Of invasive species at pet stores and seafood markets in Minnesota. And we conducted a survey of businesses involving live organisms, which I'll refer to as the seller survey. So before we go any further, we have a little poll for you all. We're wondering, does your province or state regularly conduct outreach to businesses that use live organisms? So Gabby, there's the poll. There you go. Thank you. Just curious to hear, you know, how common it is to be doing that periodic outreach to businesses. So it looks like it's close to maybe 40%. A lot of people don't know. So that's really interesting to see. Yeah, so for Minnesota, it's variable across each of these trades. We have more of a connection to kind of bait dealers, but not as much with some of the businesses and the other live organism trades. So for our seller survey, we did a direct mailing to more than 3,500 businesses. And some gains from doing this are that they also helped us to educate businesses about invasive species regulations, let them know about that new website content, and invited them to join an email list so we have a better way to stay in contact with them. The survey was completed by horticultural, bait, pet, and licensed food businesses. You'll see that we've had small sample sizes in some cases. I wanted to note this, but I also want to note that we previously had no present day sense of these businesses' awareness and concern about invasive species. There's around 77 aquarium businesses that we know of in Minnesota, and many of those are big box stores. So we need to work with corporate offices for those. So we see this as a starting point for Minnesota in all of these trades. And within each trade, I also want to note that respondents were really diverse. In the horticultural side alone, we had retailers, growers, landscapers, some government entities, distributors, wholesalers, a farmer, and so on with each of these other trades. So in the future, it would be great to be able to provide information specific to each one of these groups. So now we'll dig into some of the results. The findings I'll present for this next part of the talk are primarily from that seller survey, but I'll add in some related things that we've learned from the industry workshop and retail assessment as well. So first, we asked some basic questions about attitudes related to invasive species and their management. From top to bottom here, we asked about their level of agreement with the following statements. I'm concerned about invasive species in Minnesota. Preventing the spread of invasive species is the right thing to do. And it's my responsibility to ensure that my business does not contribute to the introduction and spread of invasive species. So generally we see that most respondents are concerned about and take responsibility regarding invasive species. We did have a subset within each trade that disagreed. So we need to be conscious of kind of these differences in opinion and try to meet folks where they're at. From that industry workshop, there was a feeling that a lot more work is needed and that enforcement is not strict enough. Some participants actually recommended to increase inspections and enforcement. And in the retail assessment, our contractor found that pet store staff are generally positive and knowledgeable. One potential source of bias, and this goes for both surveys we'll be talking about today, these folks are reporting to a regulatory agency, so might not be as likely to report if they do disagree. We also asked whether or not the sellers were providing invasive species educational materials to their customers, and if they would be willing to distribute educational materials if they were provided for free. The majority of sellers are not providing educational materials, and the retail assessment showed this too. However, it's encouraging that most businesses would be willing to distribute those in the future. And many respondents in the survey also reported that they do remind customers not to release live organisms, even if they aren't handing out physical educational materials. We asked folks to rank specific resources and initiatives based on their likelihood of helping them, other businesses, or their customers prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species. And the pattern you see here generally held across the trades. So of the resources and initiatives that we suggested, The ones that were seen by respondents as most helpful were an invasive species identification and best practices guidebook for employees, educational materials for customers, generally say not to release invasive species, and online training for employees. The idea of a voluntary training and recognition program for businesses, for example, where businesses could publicize completion of invasive species prevention training in their marketing efforts, was seen as slightly less helpful than those top three, but could still be a useful addition. And regulatory enforcement, again, was something we wanted to include here because it came up in that industry workshop. But it wasn't surprising to see some concern with this come up in some of the survey comments. And we also asked about customer commitments. This was described in the survey as commitment forms for customers to sign pledging that they will not release invasive species or will dispose of bait in the trash. So this idea stemmed from that DNR community-based social marketing project that I mentioned, and knowing that commitments can have a greater effect on changing behavior than awareness alone. However, there wasn't a ton of support for this idea among survey respondents. It's possible, though, that respondents were unsure of what this meant. So we might still investigate this further, and I think Tina will be talking about this as well. But all in all, the responses to this question will be particularly helpful in guiding future work. Lastly, we wanted to try to understand respondents' awareness of invasive species regulations and get a sense of the availability of invasive species in retail stores. So we asked if they were aware that possession and sale of some species is prohibited, if they offer any regulated invasive species for sale at their business, and if they had offered any prohibited invasive species for sale at their business over the last 5 years. It appears that respondents were generally aware and that some species are illegal to sell and did not offer invasive species for sale at their business. Again, this is self-reported to the DNR. We know some respondents may have had some discomfort with answering that third question regarding sale of prohibited species. So let's jump into what we learned from that retail assessment. So for this project, we hired Fortin Consulting to visit Minnesota aquarium retailers and seafood markets and examine stocks for invasive species. They also spoke with and educated store staff. Fortin visited nearly all known aquarium and live seafood markets in Minnesota, including through a separate project funded by Hennepin County's invasive species program. And I'm primarily going to be reporting on findings from the DNR project here, but in general, the findings were similar across the two projects. So before I dig into the results, we have another poll for you here. We'll see if you can guess what we found in this retail assessment. So what type of prohibited invasive species was found in the retail assessment? Okay, most of you had guessed plants. Second most common was crayfish, followed by snails, and then fish. So here are some potential risks that we identified with the retail assessment. Prohibited invasive red swamp or Louisiana crayfish, the Procambarus clarkii, was found at 2 pet stores as part of our project. In speaking, so those of you who chose crayfish, good for you. Good job. In speaking with the sellers and identifying the species as part of this project, it became clear that crayfish identification is a real challenge for sellers. Even experts need to use a microscope and look at tiny structures to confidently identify crayfish to species. We worked with an expert crayfish taxonomist, Will Budnick, at Michigan State University to assist with crayfish identification. And Will is also going to be involved with a project assessing the availability of crayfish at stores around the Great Lakes region, and ultimately see if it's possible to develop a crayfish identification guide that's usable by retailers. So I think that is a really valuable project. There was also evidence of other prohibited species being sold. A few stores had signs on their tanks indicating that they sold some prohibited invasive species, including the weather loach and Louisiana crayfish, but the species itself wasn't present. So this occurred at both the pet stores and seafood markets. Some of the seafood markets also advertised what looked like Louisiana crayfish on their websites, but they were not observed by Fortin Consulting staff during their visits. I'll also note here that there was a language barrier at some of the seafood markets, so more work is needed to be able to provide education there. All 57 pet stores visited carried either regulated or prohibited invasive species. Commonly sold regulated invasive species included goldfish, koi, Brazilian waterweed, non-native water lilies, and red-eared slider turtles. So all of those were found at greater than 40% of stores, pet stores. And they also observed sale of Carolina fanwort, parrot's feather, water hyacinth, water lettuce, and rusty crayfish. Hitchhiker crayfish, snails, duckweeds, and common sylvinia were observed in 18 pet stores. Even more stores reported that they often receive hitchhikers. One store manager said that they once had a single order that had as many as 60 tiny crayfish in it. The stores reported that they managed these hitchhikers in different ways, like freezing and disposal, or giving them away to customers or employees. Hitchhiking of organisms is a known issue that has been documented in past research as well. And many species are sold in these trades, and scientific names often are not used. Fortin Consulting documented over 500 varieties of just fishes in their trips to pet stores. We know there are a lot of species in the trades, but we don't have the capacity to conduct risk assessments for every species. Scientific names often are not used. There's many common names for some of these species, and it can be difficult to detect them and difficult for suppliers and retailers to know what they're getting or selling as well. So those are some of the key findings from the retail assessment. These findings are largely consistent with past research, including surveys done as part of a Habitatitude program. So the value of this was really to make contact with and educate sellers and get a basic understanding of what's currently out there in Minnesota shops. It's important to note that this represents only a snapshot in time, and further work would be needed to really represent the availability of invasive species in these and other trades in Minnesota. So what were some of the main recommendations that came out of these projects? Keep working with industry to better understand how we can help them in invasive species prevention efforts. Provide periodic education to stores, including with direct contact. Support industry in providing educational materials to customers, for example, by providing materials that they can distribute. Improve existing educational materials. Several projects suggested further developing our website to include nice photos of the invasive species in these trades to watch out for. Improve communications about best practices for disposal and provide options for disposal or rehoming. We have done some of this, but could do more. Educate and collaborate with other invasive species partners. The retail assessment suggested partnering more with local level partners. Create a reward for sellers who do the right thing. An example of this could be that training and recognition program that we talked about. Conducting periodic inspections. Fortin Consulting did some store revisits and revealed high species turnover at the pet stores and seafood markets. And simplify state invasive species regulations and work with other states to consolidate lists of regulations. So now we'll shift to think about hobbyists and consumers and how we might be able to help them prevent invasive species introductions. And I'm going to kick it over to Tina to talk about this.
Thanks, Chelsey. So yeah, as Chelsey mentioned, we hired a contractor, Invasive and Beyond Attitude Consulting, to develop and administer and analyze a survey online for aquarium and water garden hobbyists in Minnesota last summer. The purpose was to gauge attitudes, behaviors, barriers, motivators, and communications preferences of these hobbyists. And little data on these hobbyists in Minnesota existed beforehand, just as with the businesses. So we are excited to collect this baseline data on this group. The survey was distributed through DNR email listservs, our website, social media, and through hobbyist groups. And we also asked locally owned independent pet stores and garden stores to distribute a flyer with the survey link during the survey period as well. So we got 479 respondents to this online survey. And just keep in mind, given the distribution methods, that this is likely an audience, the respondents are likely those that are a little bit more tuned in to invasive species issues in Minnesota. Next. So here is our final poll question for you. How many respondents said they were completely aware that it is illegal to release non-native plants and animals into Minnesota waters? And as you answer this question, I'd like to mention that the full survey report and all the reports that Chelsey has mentioned are all on our website, and that was shared in the chat a little earlier today. So lots more information in those reports. All righty. So it looks like 40% of you guessed 60%, and another 25 guessed 20%, and another 20% guessed 80%. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what it is. So this slide chart shows the level of awareness to a variety of invasive species topics, from completely aware in dark green to unaware in dark orange. And in the middle there, you can see illegal to release is 80%. So those that guessed 80%, you were right on that one. 80% of respondents knew that it was illegal to release non-native species into Minnesota waters. The rest of the chart shows that most hobbyists know about invasive species and know that there are laws and risks associated with their hobby. And additionally, not shown here, more than 90% of the hobbyists agreed that preventing the spread is the right thing to do, and that they're concerned about invasive species. So promotion of these social norms that hobbyists care, are aware, and want to do the right thing will be an important tool moving forward. We did find that only 1/3 of the respondents knew which species are illegal to possess and sell in Minnesota. The other third needed more information, and another third did not know at all. So this suggests we have some work to do educating people, especially on species-specific regulations. So sources for species are different for animals and plants. Sources for aquarium owners are different than sources for water garden owners on where they get their species. So you can show the next couple of things here, Chelsey, thank you. And so you can see locally owned independent pet stores and hobbyist clubs are top sources for both aquarium owners and water garden owners. And many hobbyists buy species online from a variety of sources. So this kind of matrix of sources, where aquarium owners get their stuff, where water gardeners get their stuff, if they're buying plants or if they're buying animals, they're all different. So this kind of makes it challenging for reaching people directly where they acquire species, as well as multiplies the potential sources of invasive species and hitchhikers. Next. So As far as hobbyist activities and risks are concerned, some potentially risky species are fairly common, such as crayfish, turtles, and snails, although some of these may be naturally occurring in outdoor ponds. The preferred plant disposal methods include disposal in the trash, composting, or sharing or trading, and generally not wanting to waste any plants. And more than half of the hobbyists say that they check their purchases for hitchhikers, and half of them quarantine new plants and animals, which suggests hitchhikers are a common problem. And 21% had ponds near other water bodies, but luckily few reported flooding. Next. So this survey addressed euthanasia a bit, and which can be a sensitive topic. So in this set of questions, we gave respondents options for what to do with an animal they could no longer care for or no longer wanted to keep. The dark green is completely agree and dark orange is completely disagree. You can see most would not consider releasing. About 40% would be willing to euthanize an unwanted animal. They would rather euthanize than release the animal. They would not rather release the animal than euthanize it. And they would go to great lengths to find an alternative. So a majority of respondents would more likely to euthanize an unwanted animal than release it. And they would also go to great lengths to avoid either of those. So again, like Chelsey mentioned, since this is reporting to a regulatory agency, there may be bias in some of this response, but in general, it's good to see that people really want to avoid releasing animals and are willing to pursue alternatives. So the results of this survey highlighted many opportunities to engage hobbyists on this issue. And hobbyists are willing to commit to preventing the spread of invasive species. Like Chelsey mentioned, commitments are a significant behavior change tool. People who commit to taking action are more likely to do so. And we were surprised to find that more respondents were willing to take the more complex pledge on the right versus the simple signature pledge on the left. So they're willing to make significant commitments to preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species. And so I think this is something that we will be pursuing in our engagement work, is an opportunity to work with sellers to gather commitments from their customers and just providing sellers with a little bit more background on the importance of the commitments and why they're being taken to get a little bit more buy-in. Next. Hobbyists are also willing to buy similar low-risk alternatives to invasive plants and animals. An initiative that could be done could be similar to the British Columbia's Grow Me Instead program, which informs gardeners about invasive species and provides low-risk alternatives. Next. And then many hobbyists would be more likely to purchase from sellers who've participated in an invasive species prevention program. And so this is another opportunity to engage sellers on this topic and to get them to participate in a prevention program. And then finally, here are some recommendations that came from the analysis of the survey results. We want to continue outreach to hobbyists, gather commitments, provide information on rehoming and euthanasia, use marketing to increase demand for low-risk alternatives to aquatic invasive species. We can equip our watercraft inspectors with information on ponds and aquariums. We can improve existing educational materials, and we can provide rehoming options and establish a training and recognition program with branded materials. And these initiatives will help us promote the adoption and consistent practice of desirable AIS prevention behaviors with these target audiences. I think now I kick it back to Chelsey to wrap us up here.
Thanks, Tina. So yeah, now we'll just talk a little bit about online sales and issues that extend beyond Minnesota's borders. We know that many regulated and prohibited invasive species can be purchased online. A major recommendation from our industry workshop was to work with online retailers to educate and encourage them to stop selling invasive species and address other supply issues. So I'll talk through a couple of projects and challenges related to this. We've had multiple reports in the past year of Minnesotans selling prohibited invasive species on social media. But for these social media reports, even though the sellers appeared to be in our jurisdiction, it can be very difficult to actually identify the seller for the purpose of enforcement. So there's often not capacity to do this. So this is one of the challenges that we're facing, and I expect others are facing this as well. Another notable project is the Great Lakes Detector of Invasive Aquatics and Trade, or the Gladiator project, aimed at reducing the availability of invasive species online. This project was led by the Great Lakes Commission and used an automated web crawler software to search the internet for sellers of a list of high priority invasive species. And representatives of state natural resource agencies then contacted the sellers that were identified by the web crawler to educate them about invasive species regulations and ask them to either stop selling the species or put a notice on the sale page and have shipping restrictions to states where the species is prohibited. Unfortunately, many of the contacted sellers did not respond to the outreach or did not change their behavior. So there may be a need for additional authority or enforcement in this area. That said, this project provided a reasonable means for identifying these sellers, which I feel is extremely critical for invasive species prevention efforts. Many of you are likely aware too that zebra mussels were found contaminating aquarium mossballs last spring. I also want to acknowledge this response that occurred last year as an example of partnerships across agencies that worked really well, I believe in both the US and Canada. And that said, I suspect there's room for improvement and increased capacity to respond to similar scenarios in the future. And I believe there's currently national level efforts underway related to that. So just to wrap up, I'll say I think there's so much more we have to learn with regard to the risk associated with these trade pathways and how to best address them. Most of our findings are consistent with past research, but kind of give a present day look at Minnesota in particular. So these issues have been around for a long time. I hope that we can continue to develop partnerships with industry and hobbyists, and we're definitely very interested in the community's thoughts on next steps with all of this. And then before we jump into discussion, we want to acknowledge the many individuals who supported this work as well. Businesses and hobbyists who participated in our workshop and surveys, Carolyn Dindorf and her team at Fortin Consulting, Ken and Kat Donnelly, Doug Jensen with Minnesota Sea Grant, Erica Jensen, who led the Gladiator project, and many others. And this work was funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and State Invasive Species Plan implementation funding through the Fish and Wildlife Service. With that, we can take any questions.